When you read the Buddha's accounts of his own quest for awakening, it's hard not to be struck by how many times he asks questions of himself, and how his quest is directed by his questions. It starts when he sees a problem. Here he is, subject to aging, illness, and death, and yet he seeks happiness in things that are also subject to aging, illness, and death. What if you were to seek happiness in things that didn't die? The question suggests a possibility that he hadn't thought of before. And so, as he says, he goes off in search of what is skillful. It shows that he already had some assumptions there, that there was a way, a method of human action that would lead to the deathless, and he wanted to find the skillful means to get there. So first he goes to study with a couple of teachers who claim that they know the path to happiness, but he's not satisfied with their teachings. So he says, what if I were to go off and practice on my own, practice austerity? So he asks that question of himself. After he has those three similes of the wood, sappy wood near water, sappy wood away from the water, and then the dry wood away from the water, which is the one that you can actually use to give rise to fire. So he decides that he has to do without pleasure entirely. That's how he interprets the meaning of its simile. And so he tries the trance of no breathing, gets horrible pains in his head, pains in his body. He asks himself, what about if we were to go without food entirely? And the Devas come and say, if you go without food entirely, we're going to infuse divine food in through your pores. So he dismisses them and says, well, what if I were just to go without food, but take just a little tiny bit of food, say a handful of beans every few days? So he tries that. He does that for 6 years. He gets so thin that he falls over every time he tries to urinate or defecate. When he touches his stomach, he can feel his spine. And finally, after 6 years, he asks himself, could there be another way? This way is obviously not working. Then he remembers when he was a child, meditating under a tree, and he entered the first jhana. Could that be the way to awakening? And the consciousness arose to him that yes, it would be. But even then, he tested it. As he says in one of his accounts, he first decided, how about if I divide my thinking into two sorts, skillful and unskillful? He tries that. When he noticed that his thinking was unskillful, it was imbued with sensuality, ill will, harmfulness, he would beat it down. And whenever his thoughts were not imbued with those things, then he would allow them to range freely. Until he saw that all of his thoughts were skillful, but then even then the mind was tired with all that thinking. So he brought it to stillness in the jhanas. And even here he was motivated by that original desire. What is skillful? So when he attained the different levels of jhana, each time he looked at it as an activity. What here is still stressful, even in the jhana. You could ferret out the different factors that were important in one level of jhana, but would prevent it from going to another level of jhana. And they were a disturbance to the mind, so he would drop them, go into deeper levels of jhana. Got to the fourth jhana, and he started directing his mind to different questions. Is this the only life that there is, or have there been lives previous to this? And he had memory of many, many previous lifetimes, aeons and aeons. But he didn't stop there. Some of the texts talk about other teachers of the time who had attained a similar knowledge. Once they'd seen many previous lifetimes, they'd set themselves up as great philosophers, explaining this is the way the world is. The world is eternal. Or sometimes if they had memories going back to previous lifetimes, but then they'd hit a time when they were totally insentient beings. Couldn't remember past that. So, there was a point where I didn't exist, and then existence came to being, so the world must be not eternal. But the Buddha's question again was, what was the most skillful use of this knowledge? So he didn't stop there, moved on. Knowledge of all beings dying and being reborn. Because the question was, does this happen only to me? Does it affect other beings? And what's the basic underlying pattern? Here he saw beings dying and being reborn in line with their karma. Now again, he didn't stop there and set himself up as an expert on karma, teaching about karma, or just that much about karma. He said there must be some other use for this knowledge. What's the most skillful use? We applied it to his own intentions in the present moment. Traced the suffering he was feeling, the aging, illness, and death that he was trying to get past, traced that back to ignorance. In this case, it turned out to be ignorance of what he later taught of the Four Noble Truths. He realized that there were duties that you had to fulfill with regard to those truths. Again, what's the most skillful use of this knowledge? That was the question that kept directing his practice. So he fulfilled the duties with regard to the truths, comprehended stress, abandoned its cause, realized its cessation from having developed the path. Kept questioning himself. What's the best use here? What is this? What's the cause of this? And he kept questioning and questioning and questioning. Finally got to awakening through questioning. That's why when he taught, he encouraged his students to question as well. He realized that some questions were useful, other questions would lead you astray. Because after all, what is a question? It's the framework of a sentence, but it's got a big gap. When you ask a question, you're either hoping to find knowledge yourself, or you're trying to get other people to fill in the gap for themselves. But the question is not totally amorphous. It has a frame. And you saw that some frames would give you unskillful information, and others would give you more skillful information. After all, that frame about which type of life is best, the life of sensual indulgence or the life of self-torment. He'd answered, well, the life of self-torment, and later realized that that was a poorly formed question. Well, the question about what is the origin of the world, if that was the question that motivated him, then he would have stopped with the first or the second knowledge. He realized he had to reframe the question in order to get something useful out of it. So this taught him several things. One is that questioning is what motivates you to find awakening. After all, as a prince, if he had simply accepted what everybody had told him, hey, you're a great prince, have a good time, go out and do some battles like princes do, enjoy your sensuality. If he hadn't questioned that, we would have had a Buddha. So that's one of the important functions of questioning, is that it shows that there's this gap. Something's missing in life. True happiness. knowledge about how to find true happiness. These are the missing parts. Without a sense of that gap, you get very complacent. But it's also important when you ask these questions that you learn how to frame the gap and give it the right shape. You can think of a question as a missing part of an instrument or a missing part of a tool. If you're using the wrong tool, then no matter how many wise people tell you about what you're missing, it still doesn't solve the problem. You may get the missing piece to the tool, but it's the wrong tool for your purpose. You haven't really benefited. So this is why when the Buddha taught, he encouraged people to ask questions, but he also encouraged them to frame their questions in the right way. The questions he encouraged basically come down to this issue of what's skillful, and then how to understand the Four Noble Truths, how to develop the skills appropriate to those Four Noble Truths. Those are the questions he asks you to focus on. And you look at the different questions he encourages. When you go to see a teacher, one, ask yourself about the teacher. Is this the sort of person who would tell a falsehood, pretend to know something he didn't know, either because of passion or greed, aversion or delusion? You've got to check out the teacher first, realizing you can't just trust anybody you come across. You've got to look at that person's behavior. When you feel confident that this is the sort of person you can trust, then you listen to that person's Dharma. One of the first questions he has you ask is, what is skillful and what is unskillful? Then when you've learned that from the teacher, you go off and practice on your own. But you keep on asking questions, because you don't just stop with the definition of what's skillful or a few rules about what's skillful. You actually look at your own behavior. This is the essence of his teachings to Rahula. How to check your behavior, check your motivation, check the actual results you get from your actions. And if you see anything harmful coming from them, then you've got to go back and learn how to act in another way, how to speak in another way, how to think in another way, both through your own observations and through getting advice from other people on the path. At the same time, you support that quest for skillfulness with questions that are supposed to inspire heedfulness. After all, the Buddha didn't say that we become skillful because we're innately good, or just comes natural to us, so that somehow once we can scrub away all social conditioning, we'll find our wonderful true nature that we can trust. Complacency is one of the things he warned against. Skillfulness comes because you realize that your actions make a difference and you have a tendency to act in unskillful ways. So there are those questions as you ask at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. The beginning of the day, as the sun rises. My death could happen today. Is there anything in my mind that would cause me to do something unskillful? Is there any unfinished business? And if there is unfinished business, he says, quickly try to straighten out the mind, with the same sense of urgency as if your head were on fire. Ask yourself just the same question at sunset. I might die tonight. Am I ready to go? Well, if not, quickly work on what you need to do. Particularly, you want to focus on your mind. As he says in one point, even though you can't read other people's minds, learn how to read your own mind. Look for the skillful and unskillful qualities you have there. If you sense anything that's unskillful, again, as if your head were on fire, try to straighten it out. If you sense skillful qualities, we'll try to develop them even further. When you learn how to read your mind in this way, developing both that sense of heedfulness and greater skill in how you manage your practice of virtue, concentration, and discernment. You finally get to those questions that he asked the five brothers. Is form constant? And you say, well, it's inconstant. If it's inconstant, is it something pleasant or stressful? Well, if you're trying to find true happiness there, it's going to be stressful. And if it's inconstant and stressful, is it worthy of being called yourself? Yes, the same questions of feeling, perceptions, fabrications, consciousness. The asking of the question is meant to open up your attention to an area where there's been a gap, where there's been something missing in your knowledge. And as you learn how to see, as you learn how to fill in that gap in your knowledge, and then you can let go. This is how awakening comes. It comes through questioning, having a sense of these gaps. Gaps in your heedfulness, gaps in your skillfulness, gaps in your understanding. Without that sense of those gaps, you stay as complacent as ever. Nothing ever happens. Nothing ever develops. It's when you sense the gaps and the need to fill in those gaps that's when freedom can come about. So just as the Buddha's quest was shaped by his questions, our practice should be shaped by questions as well. Asking ourselves, are we heedful enough? Are we skillful enough? What skills still remain to be developed? What causes of suffering are we still holding on to? What factors of the path still need to be developed? This is why the Buddha never encouraged a dogmatic attitude, pretending to know things that you don't know. He wanted you to be very clear about where your knowledge lies and where the gaps in your knowledge lie. That gives focus to your practice. And it's meant to keep on expanding your imaginations, expanding your concept of what true happiness might be. This is one of the biggest pitfalls you see in the path, is people hit a particular level of practice. So they get a state of concentration and say, this must be it. I'm just going to hang out right here. Their imagination isn't large enough to conceive something better. This is why it's important to follow the Buddha's example, is to keep your practice alive with questions. So that whatever comes up, any state of concentration, you ask yourself, okay, what is this? Where is there stress still here in this state? What's the skillful use of this state? Any knowledge that comes up, what's the skillful use of this knowledge? And keep your imagination open to the possibility that there might be total release from suffering, and you might be capable of it. Because when the Buddha tells his life story, this is what he's trying to encourage. What he calls the craving that leads to the end of craving, the conceit that leads to the end of conceit. You want that same awakening that he had. And you tell yourself, if he could do it, why can't I? Those are the questions he wants you to ask, so you can find the same freedom that he did.